Well, hello and welcome to another one of my thoughts videos. In this one I've been rather busy lately, and so I haven't done one for a while, but I thought, and I've also been debating as to what I'm going to talk about next. I don't particularly want to perpetuate the quarantining and vaccination and all those sorts of crazy things, but maybe I will make a comment on those later on as I've come up with some new material. But I want to go back to something that is a little bit wider and to do with the next worldwide scam that we're going to have, that they're preparing for right now. It's a topic that I have thought about for many years. In fact, it was one of the first major topics that I really started to chew over when I was younger, and that is that of the finances. The world, what they call it, the financial reset that they're going, and see what the scam is going to be there, so that you might be slightly better prepared for what's in store. Now, what has stimulated this topic for me is that a week or so ago I received a video in my phone that about a young boy of 7 years old in Peru that supposedly started his own bank. He was heralded as an amazing whiz kid, genius or something rather, and was getting all the help that he could get, and that he was had his own bank, and he even had his own credit card system or whatever that he was able to afford. Now, it sounds like very all wonderful, but in actual fact it's a load of rubbish, really, in a way, because it's nothing new. Anybody can start a bank. What this kid and the school teachers and people that were aiding him were unaware of so far is that there are laws to prevent you doing this. A 7-year-old, you see, it shows that it's not rocket science. Even a 7-year-old can pick up the idea of banking. But there are serious laws for centuries controlling it, so that every Joe Bloggs on the block does not form his own bank. Only the select few multinational banking thieves can operate. And that goes way back into the system of banking. Now, recently I saw a movie on Netflix called The Laundromat. Go see it if you're interested. It gives a pretty good rundown of how the scamming world banking system works, with offshore accounts and hidden accounts and not having to declare anything, and how they use this to launder money, and it's all basically fake and all operating on credit. They did a very good job from starting from one point and moving on. But what is absent in most people's thinking is some very foundational concepts that you need to know to understand the whole deal, and the big massive scam that it really is. Now, the whole subject of finances gets very complex, and that's why we have financiers and bankers and people, and one of my sons is actually one of those sort of financiers and works in that whole field, and they talk all sorts of jargon, and there's lots and myriads of little names and policies and things that they do, but the basic concepts are not that difficult. In fact, they're so not difficult, they're like an elephant in the room that everybody misses. Way back, when I was younger, I was teaching English and had to teach bankers banking English. So I had to learn about the history of banking and how banking developed, right from when currency was gold and silver, and then they had to be put into, they couldn't carry it all around, and then banks happened, and then checks happened, and all sorts of things happened. And so I learned a lot about how the banking system works, and all of the nuts and bolts of that sort of thing. But the very concept of money, what is money? That I had been considering years and years ago. When I was even a teenager, I heard someone say that money doesn't actually exist, and I thought they were crazy. But now I actually agree. Money is only a representation of something fictitious. Money, what is money? Finances and everything is all based on the one thing that nobody talks about, and that is it's all about agreement. It is two parties agree on the value of something, and that's all it is. And this is where the big battles start, right from there. Everything comes from agreement or disagreement. Unfortunately, the banks dictate to us, and we have to do nothing but agree to them forcibly, and that is not a good deal, but it's still an agreement. Money does not exist. Cash, numbers in a bank account, all of the system that works is only a mathematical system to quantify and keep track of our perception of value, or should I put it into three words? The agreement of a perception of value. Nothing actually has a value until we agree on what that value is. A gold coin or a diamond has great value in our perception until you're stuck in the desert without any water, in which case it has zero value, and a cup of water has more value than a diamond or a coin of gold. So value is perception, and when two people want to enter into a negotiation, that perception has to be agreed upon. One may think it's worth one thing, another thing, and when they've battled it out in a short while or a long while, and they establish what that agreed perceived value is, and then they generate mathematics to quantify it, like let's say 100, it's worth 100, there's a mathematical number. Then they say, well, how are we going to keep track of this number? Say, okay, let's write it in a bank account, or let's write it on a piece of paper, or let's make shells, or let's make gold or paper or whatever. And then currency represents the perceived value that we have agreed on. And this is where this big scams happen. Value fluctuates according to the circumstances. Remember the cup of water versus a diamond. It fluctuates depending on your situation, and that perception can evaporate or consolidate whenever you want. So all of the finances and the financial system in this world is a manipulation of perception. There is nothing real about it. And the mathematics and all the gyrations of maths, where people die and live and die for the mathematical system, bears no relationship to the actual value of things. So money really doesn't exist. It is perceived value that we have agreed upon. And that perception, our agreement, can change at any time. We always consider, because the bank is very vicious with us, and our creditors and people who want money from us are very fervent in their delineating of requiring right down to the last little cent. We think that it's solid because they act very solidly. But in actual fact, money itself is very, very volatile. I found that out when I was in Bolivia back in the 80s. They had 14,000% inflation at the time. I went into the country, and an egg was worth 1,000 pesos, and 2,000 pesos. And then 9 months later, 8-9 months later, it was worth 20 million pesos. It just leapt and leapt and leapt, because the perception of the value of that cash, that representation of value, meant nothing, because perception is what meant something. Inflation is the difference between one party's perception of value and another party's perception of value. The buyer has a low amount of money, and the seller wants a higher value, puts a higher value on the thing. So the other wants to get their wages up, then the prices go up, and the difference between this one and that one is inflation. A perception difference between what one's earning and what one is spending. So inflation
is a problem that happens that if, and some people have said, well, why don't we just print more money if it's not real? And unfortunately, just printing more currency, making more shells or rocks or gold or silver or whatever, dollars, euros, it doesn't matter, because if you print more money, our perception of the availability makes inflation start happening. And so it creates problems. So you can't just print more money, because that affects the perception that people have. And you can't just print more money, although the Federal Reserve in the United States does exactly that. And my economy son told me recently that they have passed some laws or something where the Federal Reserve can now buy things. Before, all they did was print money, and how much they could print was governed by the controls that stop people's perception going out of control. And so they would only print whatever they wanted. Exchange rates were also controlled so that our perceived value in one country is checked by a government forcibly, so that the people of one country agree on a value compared to a value in another country. So our perception of value is controlled by governments, and the accessibility of printed cash. And so therefore now in the United States, the Federal Reserve was not able to buy anything with the money that it printed. Now it is. And so since the money they print actually has no backing of anything, it's just a representation of perceived value, they can now buy anything they want, huge tracts of land and things, without any actual money at all. They just print it and buy it, which is one huge robbery. Now that gets into the situation with the banks. With all the gyrations and possible forms of controlling and manipulating the mathematical system to control our perceived value, which can evaporate at any time, the powers that be, particularly the multinationals who have been working for literally centuries now to accumulate sufficient perception, mathematical numbers that represent perception, they don't mind about lying billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. Like, how can the American government military department in 2001, I think it was, before the Twin Towers thing was, they had lost or failed to account or could not account for $4 trillion, American dollars, not just billion, $1 trillion. They're just bank numbers. The actual wealth or the actual spending actually happen in bombs, planes, military activities, whatever. But the mathematics doesn't really matter. They just write it off. When I was younger also, talking of writing off, I knew a young lady who worked in a bank, and a group of us were having coffee one day, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I lost $30,000 last week." And I said, "Whoa, what happened? Didn't they, you lose your job or what?" And $30,000, that's like half of my house sort of thing, or more than half my house. And she said, "Oh no, they just wrote it off." And I said, "Did you ever find it?" And she said, "No, I never did." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And they just said, "They just told me off and said, try and do a bit better job." And they wrote it off. Because the mathematical system has systems to just disappear numbers if it wants to, call writing off. Loans and all of that are basically slavery, where a bank will keep you enslaved to paying interest on money which is not actually even theirs, which doesn't actually exist, it's just a theory, and has you slaving your butt off, paying interest rates which they can then change at any time they want, and it makes no difference. And if anything happens, if you default on your loan, like Mexico once upon a time declared itself bankrupt, and I thought, oh, the world's going to crash or what? But no, life went on. The humongous billion trillion dollar debt that Mexico had, they just wrote it off and started again. How is that possible? Because the basic foundation of it is purely perception of value that we have agreed on, that then plugs into a mathematical system to keep track of that perception. So they decided that in their perception, they owed nothing. And they just wrote it off, and the bankers said, agreed, and continued on with life. Mexico is doing fine still, even though it had declared itself bankrupt. Another example of this writing off and resetting of things is Bolivia. After that 14,000% inflation back in the 80s, I think it was a little later in the 90s or somewhere around there, the government of Bolivia decided it was going to reset its economy and just wiped 6 zeros. You basically, what you had today was worth 1/1,000,000th of what it was yesterday. And what happened? A whole bunch of people suicided, a whole bunch of people cried, a whole bunch of people just went on with life per normal because they didn't even use money. They just swap a bag of potatoes for that of carrots, and Bolivia continued on. Did Bolivia collapse? No, it didn't. They reset. And this is what brings me to the biggest scam we're going to see, or the next scam we're going to see. The whole quarantining of the world is part or a lead up to the big economic reset. It is also a big scam. What are they trying to do? All throughout through the history, through the centuries, there's always been a plan of some power trying to take over and be world dominance. They've achieved a certain amount of success in a country, in a continent, in a wide range, and the last biggest one was the English Empire, which managed to take possession of around about 60% of the planet, I think, something like that, and governed by one family, basically. But a couple of centuries ago, a new phenomenon happened where human beings became redundant, and now the world takeover is by a non-human entity called multinationals. Through laws, particularly in the United States, or for centuries, corporations have been controlled by governments. It started way back in the Roman times when the people would club together and form a corporation, a corporation to achieve public works, and then they were disbanded after the work had been completed. Through the centuries, those kings and queens and governments that were maintaining control could see that the corporations, if they grew too large and too strong, they would depose the king or queen or whoever, and so they were greatly controlled. But in the United States, with the Industrial Revolution, there were no kings or queens to govern, and so there was open doors for multinational corporations to form, and they worked very hard through oil discovery and the Industrial Revolution to become quite rich and start manipulating governments to give the corporations more and more power, and they eventually were afforded the same rights as a human being. And the corporation grew so big they became multinational, and now we have the multinational corporations who have the same status as human beings, even though they are not. So it was the first time in history that a non-king or queen or government were going to try and take power, and they were going to do it through economics. The Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the big guys there managed to grow bigger and bigger until they had accumulated sufficient finance or perceived value in their bank accounts to be able to finance world wars. The First and Second World Wars were essentially financial concerns to generate more numbers in the mathematical system for those powers that be, the banks and the multinationals. That has progressed through history until the present day, and the quarantining of the planet is just a ploy to set up a system where the perceived value of things is now been transferred into fictitious numbers in bank accounts. And the multinationals the banks have managed to get countries into debt sufficiently so that they can now reset the economy. What they are trying to do in the reset, and which you will see very soon, is that every country that has a debt can be forgiven their debt can be written off, which is very easy because that which they owe doesn't actually exist in reality. So it's easy just to wipe the numbers, just like they did in Bolivia, and with the power that those numbers have, they can then, the multinationals and bankers can exercise their power and strong arm those countries into giving up their sovereignty. That means that they have no sovereignty, they do not own their land, their resources, the people in it, and what you can do or think or everything you have is no longer yours. That is the baseline of the Great Reset. You lose your sovereignty. Now, all of that is a very sneaky and crafty method where those multinationals, bankers, have been working tirelessly for a couple of centuries at least to accumulate enough numbers which are fictitious, and they can do it through the banking systems that can generate numbers fictitiously and disappear numbers and manipulate and control the things so that they have enough perceived power to strong-arm governments. Now, what is the solution to that? What Mexico did, and what Bolivia and other countries have done in the past also, is if the world said, excuse me, bankers, we've already paid you double, triple, quadruple what we borrowed. It's time for us to say, no more. You got your money back. No more. Deal cancelled. Put your foot down and say no. It'll be interesting to see how many countries are willing to do that and who are not willing to cede their sovereignty, but reject the deals, the crooked deals of the international bankers and multinationals behind it. So what does that mean for us? Well, you and I on a daily basis are powerless to do anything. We can just watch the international drama play through. But what you need to do on an individual level is start to realize and understand the basic flaws of the system that we are obliged to use and try and get around it. Understand what has real valuable, tangible valuable, like food, clothing, your housing and everything like that, and place your confidence in those and not in a fictitious mathematical system that has methods of disappearing numbers and inventing numbers at will, even though it looks viciously solid and concrete. The bankers rely on you trusting the solidity of maths, but working in vague, ethereal smoke. So that is finances. What we are forced to use is seriously flawed, and we need to learn to live outside, or at least around it.